Hello, I'm back, and so is the turtleneck. My favorite trope from mad scientist type science fiction stories is the guy who experiments on himself. You know, the lizard from the Spider-Man comics, or the fly, or Zat. It's great because no scientist would ever do something like that in real life. Science is all about testing and looking at the data and coming up with hypotheses and then trying to support them. And oh, look, here's an article about a guy who experimented on himself by injecting himself with bacteria that he found in the Siberian permafrost. He says that he hasn't caught the flu since, even though he has no idea why it ought to be helping him. To quote, "But we do not know exactly how. In fact, we don't know exactly how aspirin works, for example, but it does." It's a very logical explanation, really, for injecting yourself with bacteria from millions of years ago. But maniacs like Anatoly Bruchkov are a dying breed. Science used to be a means to peer out into the unknown, to test the limits of our reality. Now, it's a job. A job with strict rules and ethics and policies against being completely insane. Data intake, like I said, is the bulk of what they do, as well as interpreting it. That approach doesn't sit well, though, with everyone who's ever earned a degree. There's still some people who would rather push the limits of what they're expected to do. While the vast majority of science folk are methodical and calculating, there are exceptions. In this video, we'll talk about a few of those exceptions. Having covered Anatoly, the bacteria repository, let's move on to another practitioner of cowboy research, Dr. Phil Kennedy. The Irish-born Kennedy became a luminary of computer neural interfaces in the 90s when he managed to get a locked-in patient, that's somebody who's unable to move at all, they're completely paralyzed, to communicate with a computer using electrodes that were connected to his brain. If I remember correctly, it was pretty simple stuff. He was able to do binary commands, but still, it was a massive leap forward, and it made Kennedy a pretty big celebrity in the science world for a little while. But further advances in the field have been slow. The electrodes remain difficult to implant and highly intrusive. Funding is not exactly abundant because communication is more of a quality of life improvement than an absolutely vital one, so it's not everyone's priority, understandably so. And it's just not all that appealing to people who don't need it. You might think, well, it'd be pretty cool to have a computer connected to my brain, and then you think about it for a second, and then you realize, no, it wouldn't. You'd have to have a hole in your skull and electrodes and stuff. It's really unpleasant. You know who knows it's unpleasant? Phil Kennedy. You know how he knows that? Because he went to Belize and had the only neurosurgeon the country had ever produced at that point stick electrodes in his brain to do an experiment. And he almost paid for it with his sanity. So this was just 5 years ago. It had been quite some time since he'd made any major advances, and he decided he was just going to go ahead and do it himself. So he designed this surgery. He told Dr. Cervantes, who's called, to do things exactly just so. He did, and by all accounts, he did it exactly as he was supposed to. But it turns out that it's kind of dangerous to crack your skull open and connect wires to it because, I don't know if you knew this, but the brain is an organ that was not designed to have computers connected to it. In the days following the surgery, Phil couldn't form meaningful sentences, he had violent seizures, and even lost the ability to write. Eventually he did level out, he got better, but he had to keep his skull slightly open for the duration of the experiment as they tested what the new electrodes were doing. But don't worry if you think that it was gross or whatever. He hid his exposed brain under a Panama hat. Oh yeah. Not much has been heard from Dr. Kennedy since that little escapade in South America, and when Wired wrote the article about him around that same time, kind of brought him back into the public eye, but looking up stuff, I haven't been able to find much about what he's up to these days, so no word on the long-term effects of exposing someone to a steady diet of brain electrodes and self-experimentation. That being said, I would not recommend having electrodes connected to your brain if you don't need them. Mark Zuckerberg already has enough access to your life. At least keep your thoughts private. Oh, yes, and an addendum to the Phil Kennedy story. He wrote a sci-fi novel a few years ago about a brilliant Irish-born brain science pioneer who put his mind inside of a robot. I think I might know what this guy's endgame is. Continuing with the theme of surgery that you really shouldn't do to yourself unless you need to, have you ever had your appendix removed? I hear it's rather unpleasant. Now, have you ever removed your own appendix? I hear that's a bit more unpleasant. The reason I ask is there are actually two people that I've found in researching this episode who actually accomplished that feat. One was Dr. Evan O'Neill Kane, and the other was Dr. Leonid Rozagov. What is it with Russians and being in this episode? One might think there's a theme going on here. Their reasons for performing the autoappendectomy, yes, there is a word for it, were different. Dr. Kane was testing a theory. Back when he was doing his thing in the 20s, it wasn't considered safe to give patients with heart problems general anesthetic. The thought was they might not wake up. So they decided to try out local anesthetic. This was Dr. Kane's theory, that it would work out, but it wasn't sure if that would help. Maybe it would be incredibly painful, maybe it would also be harmful some way, so he had to experiment with it. And not wanting to put somebody else through a potentially dangerous procedure, he decided to try it on himself. And yet, for some reason, he didn't just decide to be the subject of the experiment, but also the practitioner. So, applying Novocaine to the area in which he was going to be operating, he cut himself open and started looking for the appendix. Now, the appendix being an organ you could live without, it makes sense that this was the one he chose to take out, and he'd performed thousands of them in his time as a resident surgeon. Back then, they really liked pulling out the appendix. So it was a relatively pain-free job. It was easy enough to do as far as self-surgery goes. And it turns out when he actually pulled out the organ, he discovered that he already had appendicitis. So it wasn't the most absolutely mad thing he could have done. And once he was finished, he had one of his assistants stitch him back up. It was a very carefully monitored experiment. It wasn't that crazy. It just sounds crazy. No, it was crazy. I give up. It was crazy. It was insane. Don't do it. Please. It was... Dr. Rozagov might have pronounced that differently earlier. Not important. On the other hand, he was not testing a theory. He was trying to save his life. He actually did need an appendectomy. Unfortunately, he was in Antarctica at the time that he discovered he needed an appendectomy, and Antarctica did not have a wealth of surgeons around at the time. In fact, his base had one, him. So, when he diagnosed himself with this appendix problem, he knew he had two options: die or cut himself open. He chose the latter. Since this wasn't in the safe confines of a hospital, this wasn't an organized experiment like Dr. Kane's, it was quite a bit more difficult and quite a bit more dangerous. Originally, he planned on working with a mirror, trying to orient himself that way, but he found that it just wasn't good for visibility. He couldn't really find his way around his abdominal cavity, so he took off the gloves, started working by touch. There are pictures of him doing the job. I'm not going to show them. Just best I don't. Here's a picture of him when he got home, though. Look at him, all handsome and vibrant and not cut open. It took him 2 hours, but he got the job done, and he lived to tell the tale. He became something of a national hero in the Soviet Union for a little while. A perfect propaganda piece, really. Nerves of steel despite his youth. He was only 27 at the time. And a terrifying level of confidence. The only problem with Leonid is that his star was slightly outshone because just 18 days earlier, Yuri Gagarin had become the first man to go into space. So here you had two 27-year-old Soviet citizens who were performing acts that nobody else was. It was quite the golden age for Soviet propaganda. Alright, I think that's enough crazy for today. Now, I sort of presented it in this video that there are two options with science. Either totally crazy or crazy boring. There is an in-between. You don't have to consume unknown bacteria to have fun with a research career. Actually, consuming unknown bacteria could make what remains of your research career quite unfun. But, you can do fun stuff and be a scientist. There's lots of jobs that have practical applications as well as research sides to them, like designing medical products. You get to work with patients and help them oftentimes rehabilitate, as well as, the whole data collecting side of things. There's archaeology, which is a bit of a soft science. You get to do a lot of interpretive work, a lot of research, but you also get to, dig around, and that's kind of fun. It's not actually Indiana Jones, but it's still cool. But every once in a while, there comes a job where you just need a maniac who's gonna do it themselves. And I think I'm glad we have them. And I think I'm glad I'm not one. Thank you very much for watching this video. I'm trying to make one about every 2 weeks or less. And, we'll see by the time I'm done editing this if I made that deadline. Go to my website, jasperhudson.com, if you want to find ways that you can support what I do, including buying my book. Goodbye.